All right, let's get into it. Today we're talking about one of the biggest turning points of the last century, the final, super dramatic years of the Cold War. It's really a story about immense pressure, some truly radical new ideas, and two leaders, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, whose decisions would literally change the map of the world.
So to really get how it all ended, we have to go back to the early 1980s. And let me tell you, this was a real deep freeze in the relationship between the superpowers. It was so hostile, people now call it the Second Cold War. Honestly, it felt like the whole world was just teetering on the edge of a cliff.
And this new, much more aggressive vibe was really kicked off by the arrival of a new face in the White House. This was a guy who didn't see the Cold War as some permanent standoff he just had to manage. No, he saw it as a fight that could actually be won.
So Reagan comes into office, and he has a very clear mission. You have to remember, he was reacting to what a lot of people felt were the failures of the past decade. This policy of détente, easing tensions, seemed to fall apart, especially after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. So for Reagan, the time for just talking was done. It was time to show some muscle. Okay, so what was Reagan's game plan exactly? Well, it was more than just tough talk. It was a really smart, calculated strategy that had two main parts. Hit the Soviets where it hurt, their economy, and then challenge them with a military buildup they couldn't possibly keep up with.
This quote, it just perfectly captures Reagan's whole mindset. See, for decades, U.S. policy had been about containing the Soviet Union. But that wasn't Reagan's goal at all. His plan was way more ambitious. He wanted to challenge the very foundation of the Soviet system and basically watch it crumble.
The first piece of the puzzle was economic. Reaganomics was supposed to create this massive boom in the U.S. economy, but it was also a foreign policy weapon. The idea was kind of brilliant and brutal at the same time. Force the slow, state-controlled Soviet economy into a spending race it could never, ever win. Just stretch their resources right to the breaking point.
And the second part was this wild technological gamble. Officially, it was the Strategic Defense Initiative, but everybody called it Star Wars. It was this idea for a space-based shield that could shoot down Soviet missiles. Now, this was a huge deal because it totally upended the core logic of the Cold War, which was mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea that nobody would start a nuclear war because both sides would be wiped out. SDI threatened to make the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal useless, forcing them into a high-tech arms race they just didn't have the money for.
Now, right as Reagan is cranking up all this pressure, a totally new kind of leader pops up on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And he was about to respond in a way that nobody, maybe not even Reagan himself, saw coming.
When Mikhail Gorbachev took over, he wasn't some old-school hardliner, not at all. He was a reformer, a guy who looked around and understood that the Soviet Union was in serious trouble from the inside out. He knew the old ways were just a dead end and that something radical had to change.
His first big idea was glasnost, which means openness. Just think about that for a second. For the first time in basically forever, people in the Soviet Union were actually allowed to speak more freely, to even criticize the government. It was like a crack of light in a system that had been sealed tight for nearly 70 years.
And the other half of his plan was perestroika, or restructuring. This was a huge gamble, to try and jolt the dying Soviet economy back to life. He started allowing things like small businesses and a little bit of competition. It was basically a massive admission that the old, top-down communist economy just wasn't working.
So you have this incredible dynamic playing out. Reagan pushing from the outside, and Gorbachev trying to reform from the inside. But then, one single horrifying event happens that just speeds everything up and exposes the rot at the very core of the Soviet system for the entire world to see.
So, what could possibly be so devastating that it would shake a superpower to its foundations and actually put its collapse into overdrive? This, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. On April 26, 1986, the number 4 reactor at the power plant exploded, and it created the worst nuclear catastrophe in human history. Look, the key thing to understand about Chernobyl is that it wasn't just an accident. It completely laid bare the fatal flaws of the Soviet state. It was the terrifying real-world result of a system that cut corners on safety just so it could pour more and more money into the military. For Gorbachev, this was a punch to the gut. It was proof that the country couldn't afford the arms race and take care of its own people. His reforms were no longer just a good idea, they were a matter of pure survival.
So with the Soviet system exposed and really weakened, and with a leader who was actually committed to reform, the whole vibe of the Cold War started to change.
It began to shift away from pure hostility toward, well, cautious cooperation.
This timeline really just lays it all out, doesn't it? You've got Reagan's tough stance in '81, which is met by Gorbachev's totally new way of thinking in '85. Then the Chernobyl disaster in '86 adds this incredible sense of urgency. All of this was just setting the stage for the dramatic final act of the Cold War. And just like that, the whole dynamic flipped. These two men who started the decade as bitter enemies were suddenly meeting, talking, and even signing huge arms reduction treaties. It was a perfect storm. Reagan's nonstop pressure from the outside, combined with the absolute crisis Gorbachev was dealing with on the inside, created this thaw that almost nobody thought was possible.
And it all kind of leads to this moment in 1987. Standing right there at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, Reagan throws down this direct public challenge to Gorbachev. It was this incredibly powerful, symbolic demand that basically put Gorbachev's commitment to openness to the ultimate test. What was he going to do? The entire world just held its breath, wondering if this was really, truly the beginning of the end.